Nice to see everybody. Thank you for being with us today. I'm Melissa. I'm the bereavement coordinator at Lumina, and I have been in this role for the last almost 11 years now, and have spent many holiday seasons with folks in grief talking about the challenges of pretty much from the October midpoint till maybe mid-January, the challenges of that time frame, particularly for folks experiencing grief. So I'm happy to have you with us today, and I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint and kind of move through a PowerPoint. I encourage you to use the chat if you have questions or comments. I would love to receive those from you, and hope that it will feel kind of interactive as we move through the PowerPoint. And then we'll certainly have time at the end of today for, I hope, questions, comments, sharing. I'm excited to hear from you all today about your thoughts about the presentation, and to share ideas, hear your thoughts and ideas about what's worked for you all in the past as you have experienced holidays. Let me share my screen and get my PowerPoint up. And everybody see that okay and can hear okay?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Great. Okay, so let's see if I can. All right, so thinking of just a little bit about holiday time and grief, we know that holiday time can be particularly challenging for people in grief. I think we would all probably agree that holiday time is stressful all by itself. But then when we add the layer of grief and the stress that we feel as people experiencing grief on top of the already present stress of the holiday time, it can be particularly challenging. In addition, this holiday season feels particularly stressful. There are additional layers of complexity that we're adding on top of holiday time and grieving time. We have COVID restrictions, we have political tensions, we have lots of news coming our way that feels particularly challenging and hard to deal with. So this is a difficult time for all of us. It's also particularly a time where I think there's pressure to be together with friends and family. So if we are experiencing the holidays without a significant person in our life, we're experiencing it without the person who has died, that can make this time of year incredibly challenging for us. So I'd like to hear from you all. Holly's going to put up a poll, and I'd like to hear from you all just a little bit about, what feels stressful to you about this holiday time. When you think about what your biggest source of stress is for you as these holidays approach, what comes to mind for you all? I'll give you just a minute to see if you can answer the poll.
And if you're having trouble with the poll, or if you think of some other things that are not listed here, feel free to put those in the chat.
Okay, it looks like thank you, everybody, for responding. It's really helpful for me to see kind of where we are in this. And we have a pretty widespread response. It looks like the biggest one, the biggest source of stress is maybe expectations for people, closely followed by grief triggers. And then, of course, family. Always a source of joy and love, but also of stress, and closely followed by pressure to be joyful. And then certainly COVID and finances are in there. Traditions, I think, closely connected to family, and also to expectations. So I'm happy to get that response from you all. We will try to talk about many of those sources of stress today. So let's see. So let's talk just a little bit further in detail about some of the sources that make holiday time difficult for people experiencing grief. There's a lot of pressure to be joyful, to be grateful, particularly with Thanksgiving right around the corner. There's a lot of pressure to be living in a space of gratitude and thankfulness for what we have. And what we know about grief is that we don't particularly feel grateful or thankful when we're experiencing grief. COVID makes this time of year incredibly difficult for us when we're craving connection and the support of our friends or our family. Not being able to be with folks is incredibly challenging. So that's an additional layer, of course, that we've had last year and this year that makes things even feel harder. Connected closely to pressure to be happy is just that, in grief, what we know is it's very normal and natural to feel sad. And this is a joyful time of year. We enter a store and we're bombarded with, bright colors and good smells and music playing. And the environment that we often find ourselves in is in direct contradiction often with what we're feeling internally. So we can often feel like we're just, on a different page than the people around us. Grief is a very internal process. It makes us feel like we're thinking about ourselves much of the time. It's a very much a process of turning inward and thinking about who we are and what our place is in the world. That is in contradiction with a lot of the messaging that we have around holiday time, which is supposed to be about thinking about others, putting ourselves last, giving to others around us. So that also contributes, I think, to a source of stress for people. People in grief often feel guilty about how much time they're spending thinking about themselves. There's a lot of pressure to gather with family, and we'll talk further about that later in the PowerPoint, but we may want to do that and we may not want to do that as a part of our holiday time. It can be really helpful to be with family members, to gather and feel that support, but it can also be an immense source of stress. A lot of expectations about being the old version of ourselves. We are changing as a result of being in grief. We are not the same person we once were. And particularly around holiday time, I think we can be reminded of how we used to be. We can think very clearly about what we did last year at Thanksgiving. I set the table. I, made my pie dough from scratch. I, hung garlands outside the house and strung the lights. And we can very much pinpoint things that we did a year or two ago. And there can be pressure to be that version of ourselves. And we may just not feel like we can do that. There's lots of music, which we know to be a very powerful grief trigger for most folks. Music really taps into taps directly into our emotions and often serves as a trigger to memories. And we don't often have a choice or in holiday time of whether we want to hear music or not. It just seems to be around us all the time, on the radio, in every store we go to. So we often can get triggered by music. There is a lot of emphasis on religion around holiday time, which can be really lovely for people and serve as a source of comfort. But stress, particularly for people in grief, one of the ways that we feel impacted by a loss is that we question our spirituality, or we can feel angry with God, or we can feel deserted by God. And so to have this period of time during the year where we are expected to be religious or expected to participate in religious rituals can feel really challenging for people. It's also, for a lot of folks, the first time that they're experiencing holidays without their person. And as we all know, no matter where we are in our grief experience, we know that some of those firsts can feel really challenging to us. We are unsure about how this is going to go for us. We're fearful about, what might trigger our grief. We're worried about kind of falling apart or losing control of our emotions, perhaps in social settings at unexpected times. We're just simply not sure about how the holiday time is going to feel for us. And that sense of just unknowing, I think, adds a lot of stress for folks. We know that grief is incredibly tiring. It requires a great deal of energy from us. It's very depleting. And holidays are also often tiring and depleting. And so this sort of double dose of exhaustion can really feel challenging to us. And then, of course, there is often an increase for folks in the amount of alcohol they are consuming around holiday time. It's can be a part of feeling festive and being social. There's often an alcohol component to that. And alcohol is a difficult addition to the grief experience. It can make the grief feel more raw. It can numb the grief out and prevent us from actually really feeling what we're truly feeling. It can just add sort of a fuzziness to the experience that I think often makes holiday time more challenging for us. And then last but not least, I just want to acknowledge darker days make the grief feel harder for folks. The cold, the rain, all of those sort of environmental factors around us can add to this time of year feeling particularly difficult for people. We feel more tired. We might feel more isolated within our own home. We might feel less motivated to be out and to be social. And so that happening around the same time as holidays can make for a tricky combo of factors. So let me move to, we're going to talk just a little bit about what we know to be helpful. And before I move into kind of talking about these 4 R's in more detail, what I do want to say is that we approach the grief experience at Lumina by being very intentional in acknowledging that everybody gets to figure out and find their own way through grief and to find the things that work for them and don't work for them. We really believe highly in everyone's ability to find their own way through grief. And so it's going to look very different for each person. And so as we talk about these 4 things, I want to encourage all of you to really be thinking about the ones that speak to you, and adapting these in ways that will really feel more personal for you. There is no real right or wrong way to make it through the holiday time. So these are some broad categories that we're going to talk about. And hopefully I will hear from you all at some point today about which one of these, speaks to you or doesn't speak to you. But I want you to take this information and feel free to ignore the parts that don't feel right for you and make the parts that do speak to you work in a way that feels personal to you. So we have tried to break down sort of these 4 categories of what might be helpful: reorienting, relaxing, relying, and remembering. So let's take just a minute to talk about reorienting. So as we've said already today, we know that grief is a very normal and natural response to a loss. When we experience grief during the holiday time, it's important to be able to recognize that we are currently compromised by grief. And that what that means for us is that we have things happening to us internally. Our fight or flight response has been activated. We are burning an incredible amount of energy just to stay, in the moment, day to day, to stay alive, to survive another day. That requires a great deal of energy on our part. So extra energy that we might have to devote to holiday time, to decorating, to being festive, to being social, is going to be compromised at this time. It is okay to acknowledge that you are currently compromised and to say to yourself, this year, I do not have the capacity to have things be the way that they have always been. To recognize that your loss and your grief are impacting the way that you are going to be able to approach the holidays. That often feels like a tricky thing for people to acknowledge, because I think our fear is, if I don't keep things going in the way that I've always done them, I might never get back to doing things the way that we have done them before. And perhaps you won't. But what we also know about grief is that it ebbs and flows. It changes over time. It often softens over time. And so because you allow yourself this year to do things differently and to perhaps take a step back from some of your expectations, it does not in any way mean that next year you might not, be able to take on more, or that next year you might feel like you do want to put the lights up again, or you do feel like making a turkey and a ham. It's okay to say, for right now, this is how I feel like I can approach the holidays, and that next year it will be a totally different experience, and I will see what I'm able to do next year. I want to remind you, and many of you all have probably heard me talk about this in the past, but I want to remind you about the model that we use to talk about healthy grieving. We call it the dual process model. And really what it says is healthy grief work looks like time that I spend in grief, where I am outwardly expressing my thoughts and feelings connected to the loss. That can look like crying. It can look like telling stories. It can look like making art. It can look like participating in a ritual, sharing in a group or in a counseling session, or talking with a supportive friend or family member. The other part of healthy grief work is taking a break from grief and doing something that feels nurturing, that feels replenishing to me, that takes my mind off of the weight of the loss. So we try to think about healthy grief work feeling like a fan that's moving back and forth between these two tasks. When we think about reorienting during a holiday time, it's important to also think about, how am I doing some of both of these things that are included in healthy grief work? doing a little bit of grieving in a small dose, shifting out of the grief and doing something that feels good and right for me. So when you think about your holiday traditions, your holiday plans, think about what's going to feel good to you, what feels nurturing and replenishing. Can you do some of that? And also think about what are the ways during the coming weeks, during the coming holiday time, that I can let some of my grief come up and out. You want to try to think about both of those things. If you're thinking forward about the next month and a half and you're thinking, I'm expecting myself to feel a lot of grief and to feel very emotional and sad in the coming weeks, I encourage you to think also about some ways that you might take care of yourself, what would feel replenishing, and to allow yourself to take a break from the weight of doing the work of grief. If you're thinking about holiday time and the coming weeks and you're thinking, I'm really going to try to fill up my calendar and stay busy. I have a lot of social events. I've got a lot of Zoom meetings planned. Maybe you have some travel on the calendar. You might also try to think about where are some places where I can weave in a little bit of time to let some of my grief out? Can I add in a ritual? Can I add in some space to journal or to actually allow myself to cry or to look at pictures and share stories with someone? Balancing these two things becomes very important as we think about reorienting ourselves for these coming weeks. A couple of the bullet points here that I think are important. Do what feels right to you. And that could be very different from someone else, even within your own family that you know is also grieving. It might feel really good and important to be social and to be, connected and in community with people in the coming weeks. And it might also feel right to you to pull away from some of those things, to be less social, to be more with yourself and kind of feeling safe and cocooned within your own home. Either one of those things can be okay in this moment. It's important, if you can, to try to communicate with people around you about what you feel like your capacity is at this time. What are the things that you would like to do that you feel like you can do? And let's take an example of this. I had a family last year, mom and dad were saying to me, I'm really concerned. We don't know what Christmas time is going to look like for our family in the wake of the matriarch of the family recently dying. We're worried about the kids, we're worried about them being sad, but we have all these traditions that grandma used to do, and we're not sure how many of those that we can do. As a family, they were encouraged to just talk and communicate. Parents were able to say, these are the things that are feeling really, difficult for us to do. Grandma always took the whole family on a trip every year, and we're not able to do that. And we need to let the kids know and be clear about that. And what the parents heard from the kids was, actually what's really important for us that grandma used to do was, to have these cinnamon rolls on Christmas morning that grandma always made. That felt doable to mom, and that was the way they were able to come together and kind of honor and remember grandma without it having to be this bigger thing. So communicating as a family or as a partnership or with your group of friends, this is what I feel like I can do this year, and this is what I don't feel like I can do. Being clear with yourself and with others. And a small caveat to that, I will say, is be forgiving with yourself. If you communicate that you feel like you can do something, and as it approaches, you think, I really can't do that. It turns out that's too hard to put up, the garland on the mantle this year. That just feels like something I can't do. It's okay to be forgiving with yourself and to recognize that, the grief is a little unpredictable here, and we may not know up until the moment what feels doable and what doesn't. I want to just say, you know, compromise is a good part of this. If you hear from a family member that, you know, what feels important to them is that everyone's stocking be hung on the mantle, and you think, I'm not sure I can do that. Is there some middle ground, right? That you can find together as a family. Maybe we put all the stockings up for a short period of time and then some come down, or maybe we put up some and we add dad's stocking, you know, solely on Christmas morning, or just hang his on Christmas Eve. So try to communicate and find some ways to compromise so that people's needs within the family get met. But the biggest part about reorienting, I think, is just that first step of acknowledging that you are compromised this year. At this moment in time, you are feeling compromised, and see what space, that sort of, what wiggle room that gives you just by acknowledging that. Okay, the second R is relaxing. As we have said, grief feels like stress internally in our body. All of our systems are on high alert. Our muscles are tight. Our vision is heightened. Our hearing is amplified. We are poised and ready for the next bad thing that our body is waiting for to come our way. So what this means is we're burning a lot of fuel. We're in an elevated, activated state of awareness that feels very much like we're in stress. It is incredibly important as we enter this time frame that we know to be stressful, that we give ourselves extra permission to take a break and to relax. Grief impacts us physically, it impacts us emotionally and cognitively. So what are the ways that we are going to take care of ourselves over these coming weeks? If we think about the demands that are on us, the things we mentioned in the beginning, the pressure, the family stressors, the COVID stressors, the finances, all of those things contributing to this bigger picture of us feeling really, really stressed out. How can we give ourselves a break? And it's important to think about what that means. I think when we tend to think about self-care and relaxing, we sort of have these go-tos that will say, well, I'm gonna try to, get into bed earlier, or I'm gonna let myself have some tea, or I might go try to get a massage. And those things are wonderful if they actually speak to you. But I think it's really more impactful if you can kind of slow down and tune into yourself enough to say, what is it that really would feel relaxing to me? It might not look like, a massage or a manicure or pedicure or sitting with a cup of tea. It might be, I'd really like to take a long drive somewhere by myself. I'd love to carve out 2 hours and watch this documentary that several people have recommended to me. Does it feel like self-care would be something I would do by myself? Or does it feel like I would like someone to be with me? Do I need to be with others, or do I need to be alone? Sometimes in grief, I think the barrier to relaxing and being still is that we don't want to be still, because the thoughts and the feelings that bubble up when we're not distracted are very centered around the loss. So when you think about how are you going to relax, I invite you to also think about what are the barriers there for you that might be preventing you from being able to slow down and take a break. Is it possible that if you allow yourself to slow down and take a break, that you would feel some of the grief bubble up and perhaps come out? And can you let that happen? And what would be on the other side of that? That once you allow yourself to mourn a little bit, might you perhaps then be able to even more deeply relax? We spend a lot of time as grievers trying to outrun the grief. And if your ability to provide self-care and relax actually is just another way to fill up your calendar so that you don't have to feel the grief, that might not perhaps be true self-care. So being still for periods of time and just questioning yourself about what would truly feel relaxing to you. Might it be to just be in a place where you could cry and mourn and express your grief? So often when I'm meeting with people and we have moments of time in a counseling appointment where someone actually gets to feel their grief and feels free enough to let it out, what follows after that expression of emotion is some really deep feeling of exhaustion and relaxation, that once they can kind of let themselves shift into the grief and allow themselves to feel it and see that they can tolerate it and experience it, it actually feels better to them than this sort of constant outrunning of the grief. So the relaxing R is actually hard, even though it seems like a pretty basic skill. It can be a really difficult one to do. When you think about relaxing in the realm of grief work, I invite you to also ask yourself about what are the things you are doing that actually feel like they are replenishing to you in some way. For example, if you are someone who thinks, well, I take a break from the stressors of my day by tuning into this show on Netflix that I really like, and the show is about war. Is that actually replenishing to you in some way, or might it perhaps be contributing to an overall sense of stress within your body? I encourage you to really think about the way that you are relaxing and to question whether or not it is truly replenishing to you in some way. And to be intentional about, being as kind to yourself as you can possibly be. The next R, the third R, is rely. And this is inviting us to think about our support network. Who are the people around us that can be helpful and supportive to us in the coming weeks of time when we have acknowledged things are going to be extra difficult for us? Can you identify a couple of people that you think you would name as your support team? And then I invite you to then be honest about what skills those supporters possess, because most people have a small network of people, perhaps it's even just one or two people that are your sort of support team. And they don't typically all have the same set of skills. And it can be really useful to think about what your friends can kind of bring to the table. If you need someone to actually just be with you and to listen as you talk about the struggles of your grief or the current amount of stress that you're feeling, it's important to identify somebody in your support network who can do that. And that might not be the friend who, is actually really skilled at just having a fun time with you. Somebody who's more of a distractor. Somebody who you can go to the movies with, or you can call up and talk about a Netflix show with, is sometimes a different person than the person who can really get down in the deep, dark muck with you and talk about some of the really difficult and hard things that you're experiencing. And it can feel frustrating to those of us in grief as we think about, I keep trying to talk to my best friend about how hard this is for me and how much loss I've experienced. And I'm frustrated because she just doesn't want to do that with me. Okay, well, let's try to back it up and be clear about what that best friend can do and can't do. And not everybody is good at all the ways that we can support somebody. So I think it's helpful to be clear about the skills that people bring to their support role. And the second bullet point about those of us who are experiencing grief, being as clear and specific about what we need with those around us who are trying to support us. That's also not easy to do. But what I have found is the more clear we can be about what we need, the easier it becomes for the people around us to help us. If they're trying to be helpful and we're not being clear about what we need, there's often a mismatch there and causes sometimes for people another layer of stress and discomfort in the midst of the grief experience. So as we experience our own grief, I think we slowly can get more clear about what it is we do need. Often in the beginning of grief, we don't know. We have no idea what we need. When people say, you know, call me if you need me, we can often just think, I have no idea what that would be. But as we get familiar with our grief, often we get more clarity about what it is we do need. Do I need somebody that will just take me somewhere? You know, take me on an outing, go do something with me that just distracts me for a period of time? Do I need somebody that will come and look through pictures with me, or help me clean out a closet, or help me bake a pie? That's also very helpful and valuable, and much easier for the supporter to know what their role is if we can help them understand it. It's also useful, I think, as we experience our grief, to get familiar with what are the times of day or days of the week when our grief feels particularly challenging. And the more that we can kind of try to look for any pattern there, or any predictability, then we can start to kind of say, you know what, this is the time of day when it would feel really good to have a check-in phone call from you, or to get a text from you. You know, nights are hard for me. Is there something we can do at night? Can we Zoom in the evening? Can we both read a book and talk about it at night? You know, can we meet somewhere in the evening just to talk for a little bit? Or do you notice that, you know, you have the most energy and the most capacity for being social with someone earlier in the day? I think it's also nice to, you know, to be clear about that. With yourself and with others. If all of the social things that are sort of that you're looking at in the coming weeks are in the evening time, and you know that your grief feels the hardest in the evening time, you know, again, you might need to reorient a little bit with that and to say, I may not be able to do all of those evening events. That might just be too hard. Can I pick a couple of those that feel good to me? And within that, you might be able to say to a friend, hey, you know, I want to go try to do this evening thing with you, but I may not be able to make it through the whole thing. Are you comfortable with helping me leave early if I need to do that? It can be easy to isolate during this time. As we said, it's dark, it's cold, it's rainy. Grief tends to make us want to isolate and to pull inward. So I encourage you to think about ways that you can stay connected, and it doesn't have to be completely social, but finding some way to stay connected, I think can be immensely helpful in grief, to not allow yourself to fully isolate. Stay connected with one or two people can be really important. And I know that for many of us, we're experiencing Zoom fatigue at this time. We're over it. We're tired of being on Zoom and using technology. But you know, we may be looking at another holiday season where we're, you know, doing some Zoom and FaceTime calls to connect with people. If you feel like you just can text with somebody and that's your way of staying connected, that's great. What we know is just even a tiny bit of support can help a whole lot as you're experiencing grief. So I encourage you to reach out to people and to try to be as clear as you can about what you need, from them and how they can be supportive to you. The last R is remembering. As we enter holiday time, and we've acknowledged there's pressure to be happy, there's pressure to be joyful, we want to encourage you to find ways that feel authentic and genuine to you, to weave the memory of the person you are grieving into the situation. There are a lot of grief triggers around holiday time, and I want to encourage you to find safe ways for you to honor and remember your person who died. It's sometimes in the remembering that we can allow a little bit of our grief to come up and out, to be expressed, and that's the way we think grief softens over time. So I want to share with you just some of these ideas. Just lighting a candle is a very simple way. It's a short ritual that you can do in your own home that says, I'm remembering you. I light this candle in your honor. You can do that before any holiday meal. And it just feels like a nice way of saying, rather than ignoring sort of the elephant in the room, let's take a minute to just acknowledge that there are people missing that we wish could be at this gathering with us. Or you can do it alone. You don't have to be with others. You light a candle in your own home and you say, Mom, I am missing you today. Mom, I'm thinking of you. Some people carry a memento with them. A handkerchief is, a nice thing to carry in honor of someone. A small feely heart, a worry stone, someone's money clip that you now have. Some way that, they are a part of your day. They're in your pocket, so to speak. Something you can touch that feels sort of like a connector between you and them, so that as you're sort of navigating through the normalcy of the day, you have these quick moments where you are remembering them and honoring them. One of the most common things I hear from people in grief is, I don't want to forget my person. And it feels hard to see myself moving forward in the world. It feels like I'm moving farther away from my person who died. So finding ways to incorporate them into our day-to-day life, I think, can assuage some of that worry that we have. You can think about doing something that your person did, right? Did they make cinnamon rolls every Christmas morning? And is that something you want to continue? Did they have a favorite recipe that perhaps you could make at Thanksgiving or during the holiday time? Did they have a favorite movie they like to watch that you could watch in their honor? Thinking about something they did that you could incorporate into the coming weeks that would feel like a really nice way to honor them. Purchasing something that they liked and sharing it with someone in need really feels useful to people. It not only connects you to your person, but it feels, I think, for most folks, really wonderful to be able to put a little bit of good out into the world to give to someone in need in honor of your person is a great way to do that. Setting a place at the table for them has worked very well for some families, particularly at Thanksgiving when we're thinking about meals. Putting a place setting at the table for them is a nice way to just, as a group, at the start of the meal, to say, we're going to take a minute and we're going to acknowledge that Mom is not here this year and we miss her and we wish she was here. And I think what most families who do something like that will say is, it felt hard to do that. It felt like a bit of a leap to bring the sorrow into the setting. But once we kind of moved toward it and we acknowledged it, what we found is that we then had more space and more capacity to then be in the moment for the remainder of the meal. As we talked about earlier, we have a natural ability to move into grief and then to move out of the grief. And so I think what most people have shared is that they were hesitant to create a ritual at a festive event for fear of bringing sort of the sorrow and sadness into it, but that it actually ultimately felt better than trying to sort of ignore it, to have the elephant in the room where no one acknowledged it the whole day. So I would invite you to think about a way to do that, to remember your person that feels doable to you. Many families have had a toast in their person's honor, or shared a funny story or a memory around the table with other family members. So I'm going to have Holly bring up our next little poll, thinking about these 4 R's that we have talked a little bit about today. I'm curious to hear from you about which one of these feels the most doable to you: reorienting, relaxing, relying on others, or remembering. Wow. We got a lot of remembers. Relax. Okay, good. Okay, well, that is interesting for me to see. We've got pretty evenly split between reorienting and relaxing. And I will say reorienting, I think, is typically a hard one for people. It's hard to just acknowledge to ourselves and to others that we are not ourselves right now. Relaxing also feels hard. I think I get that. There's a lot of pressure to just do it all, to push on through. And what I will say is that I know grief to be very depleting to people. So the relaxing piece is also important because it sort of, I think, helps us stay healthy long term. It looks like remembering for folks feels the most doable, which I'm really happy to see. That I think within your answer, and I'm gonna make an assumption here, but I think within that answer there's some acknowledgement that our people are very much on our minds at this time of year, and so perhaps part of why it feels doable is that we're already remembering them and thinking about them. And I'm hoping it also means that you're open to thinking about ways that you might share that remembering with family members and friends. Okay, so let's think about, we've got one other question there, Holly, for people. We have one more poll about, I'm curious about if you have a different answer for this of what feels the most difficult of the 4 R's. Yeah, okay. This is so helpful for me. Thank you all for participating in the polls. I appreciate getting your feedback. I wish we were all in the same room so that we could just be talking about this. So relying on friends is the most difficult. It looks like 7 out of 13 say relying is the most difficult. And I will say, I think even if we weren't in a COVID experience right now, my guess would be that relying on friends would still be the most difficult of the 4. It's always hard to ask for help and to be vulnerable with others. But in particular, during COVID time, I think it's even harder to rely on others, to ask other people for help, because this is a time where, on top of the individual grief experiences that we're having, we also are aware that there is just collective grief and loss around us. And we're probably aware that all of our friends are compromised, are extra stressed out right now. and probably have less capacity to fulfill their role as a supporter to us. There's a lot of grief and loss right now, so I understand why it feels even harder to ask for things from our support team. And the second one there is reorienting, which, yes, also feels difficult just to acknowledge that we're a different version of ourselves. We have to try to be gentle and kind with ourselves, and that's not always easy to do, particularly when we have others around us who are relying on us for things. I have a couple of slides here with just some other ideas for how to honor and remember your person. And I'm gonna just kind of move through those because I think Holly can share these with you in an email, and I want to have just a few minutes for any questions or comments. And I want to pop out of my PowerPoint so I can at least see your faces and see if anybody is still awake. But I do want to remind you that support is always available. Individual support is available. Support groups are still happening over Zoom. We invite you to participate in those. And our Service of Remembrance is coming up on December 9th. And I invite you to participate in that, to submit names of people you are grieving, and we will honor them by reading their names and creating a little ceremony in their honor over Zoom on December 9th. So Holly will share more information with all of you via email about that. And I'm going to stop my share and make my own face way smaller. Woo, much better. Okay. I'd love to hear from people if we have any questions or comments. Cheryl, thank you for showing your face.
We had a couple comments come through in the chat. Robin mentioned that he or she uses daylight light bulbs, which I had not heard of before. So that's a nice thing to share. It seems like it's something that maybe makes the room brighter, and
Yeah.
For some folks, having light is really helpful.
That is a super helpful tip. And I do think, if we're thinking about that idea of reorienting, a piece of that is just thinking about what are the very small, tangible ways that I can be kind to myself. There's so much in grief that I think feels out of our control, that those little pieces like buying some daylight light bulbs and that maybe they'll help a little bit. I think it's really important to sort of grab on to any of those things that we do feel like we can control and make the best of them. Thank you for that idea, Robin. That's a good tip. Anybody else have a comment or thought, suggestion, something they've tried that's worked or that didn't work? You can unmute and say it if you want. That would be great. We'd love to hear from you. Oh, that's nice. Okay, Robin says, we've got a small circle of friends. We decide to text each other regularly once a week to stay connected with no obligation to reply. Oh, I like that part. And also, we are storytellers in my family. We share stories and experiences with loved ones, with new and current family members. Yes, I think that's beautiful. And one piece that I will say about the remembering is that it's important to remember that the kids in the family who might also be experiencing grief are looking to the adults to see how to approach grief, particularly around the holiday time. And if we as the adults are not willing to acknowledge that there's grief there, or if we are not moving towards sharing stories, mentioning the person's name who has died, the kids are going to follow our lead. And unfortunately, the message that we as the adults send, if we're not talking about the person or showing a little bit of our own grief, we're sending a message to the kids that it's a taboo subject, that it's not okay to talk about, and that we shouldn't be feeling any of the grief. So it's very important, I think, as adult grievers, to be willing to show a little bit of our grief to other family members. I mean, I guess it doesn't even have to be kids. You know, other adults might be looking to us to see, is this a safe place where I can talk about it? I think about, there was a woman one time in a group who invited some women over to her house to honor her husband who had died. It was his birthday, and she had a day kind of planned where these friends were going to come over. They were all going to plant a small tree in honor of her husband. It felt very special to this woman. She had it very planned out. The day came and went. The friends came. They planted the trees. No one said her husband's name. Nobody mentioned him the whole day. And she, as the sort of planner of the event, didn't feel like she could do it, because she felt like the friends were saying to her, we're not comfortable, so we don't want you to do that. And I think if we had been able to talk to the friends, they would have said, we're looking to her to sort of set the tone here. And because she wasn't mentioning it, they didn't mention it. So somebody has to be brave enough in holiday gatherings to mention the person who isn't there, to sort of be brave enough to open that door and acknowledge there's grief here and we're missing somebody. So I encourage you all to be that person. Yeah, so Cheryl says, I'm thinking of adding an ornament every year representing my son who died. Oh, I think that's a lovely idea, Cheryl. I really like that. Sometimes the rituals can feel big, you know, they can feel really big and produced, and that feels, you know, good sometimes. But I think also those really, the small things that we do often feel more meaningful. They're more doable, and they're also more tender to us. So I really like your ornament idea. Yes, and saying, I have to be the one to say his name so others know I want to talk about him. I will 100% join you in that, Cheryl. I think one of the things I hear most frequently from people in grief is, nobody says my person's name anymore. And I just want to talk about him so much. And I love it when somebody, you know, asks me about him or shares a memory they have of him with me. And it's sometimes can feel like the burden is on the griever to sort of be the one to move into that space. And that's really unfortunate. I wish that it weren't that way, but I know that it's so important for all of us who are missing somebody to know that there are other people in the world who remember our person and think fondly of them and have good memories of their time with our person. Anybody else have a thought or a question? I thank you all for hanging in there and being here today. I'm really glad to have this time with everybody. We appreciate your attention for an hour. All right, well, I will say thank you, and thanks for being here. And I hope that if you take anything away from today, please know that Lumina is available to be a source of support for you, particularly in the coming weeks. If you need extra grief support, please reach out. I'm here and available.